Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Foundations.
They are beloved for the sake of the Father. So God is choosing them. He's not rejecting them. And then he says, the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. What does it mean if somebody says, well, that's irrevocable? It means it cannot be reversed or stopped.
Yeah.
Foundations. Understanding the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. With Robbo Robinson and Mandy Warby.
We're doing a detailed series on replacement theology on foundations, and over the last little while we've been looking in particular at the meaning of being grafted into the Commonwealth of Israel. We looked at a verse in Romans that's been the cause of a great deal of confusion to many churches over the centuries, and we're going to take another look at that today.
This is, as you mentioned, it's a long-standing, dangerous doctrine, that is replacement theology. Invaded the church community very early on, and it kind of persisted under the Roman Empire. As it waned, the church empire then rose within, Rome and then all of Europe. And this great misunderstanding has had a significant impact on the Jewish people and the nation of Israel, because so many believe in Christendom that God has completely rejected the Jewish people, that everything, all the gifts, all the promises, all the blessings have been whipped away and given to somebody else.
So last time we looked at the misunderstanding from a verse in Romans 11, where Paul said, from the standpoint of the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. And we learned that the Jews are not our enemies, but enemies of the gospel because they don't comprehend it. They reject it because to them it's in contradiction to what the Torah says. This is the result of judicial blindness. It categorically does not mean the Jews are our enemies. And we want to move on now to another verse in Romans 11, which also is often misunderstood. This is towards the end of the chapter in verse 29, where Paul says, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable.
It's a very interesting verse, and I can remember learning about this verse many years ago. I remember sitting in church, hearing a message about it. And I was taught that God gives different gifts to people. They could be gifts of music or art, singing, the ability to write stories, to be a teacher. In sport, you might have a gifting or ability in business. And what the preacher said was, all these gifts God has given us and he's never going to take them away. All right, so you could be gifted to be a pastor, you could be an evangelist, you could be great at hospitality, visiting people and the sick, that's your gift and God won't take it away from you. And the preacher went on to say that when God gifts a gift or a skill, a calling, no matter what it is, it's yours forever. He's not going to take it away. You're not going to give it with one hand and then take it away. He's not an Indian giver. Yeah,
well, of course that sounds okay, but I guess contextually we're asking, is that actually what Paul was talking about?
Well, no. Contextually, that's not what Paul was talking about. The book of Romans has been described as the quintessential gospel on the doctrine of salvation. From the very beginning of the book, Paul goes on to explain the sinful, depraved state of human beings and our separation from God. And he goes on to explain that sin in that separation has left us fallen short, and that God is the only one who can provide our salvation, and it comes through Jesus Christ, through his sacrifice. There is no other way. The wages of sin is death. All of those verses that we know so well. God's law that reveals to us how sinful we are. The law is a mirror. It doesn't make us ugly. It just shows us that we are ugly. This is the point of the law. And then in the course of Paul's teaching in Romans, all of a sudden, Paul breaks into the topic of the Jews, the people of Israel. And you kind of go, whoa, whiplash, what's that about?
There's a lot of preachers who think that Paul sort of got distracted by a squirrel and went off on a tangent, and then the 3 chapters later he sort of comes back to where he was, and that was just a bit of a weird detour. We just don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, and I've actually heard that personally myself in church. Don't know where Paul's head went, but we're just going to skip these chapters and go on to the next when he gets back online. That was not the case. Paul was driving home that our eternal security, our salvation is from God and God alone. We don't do anything for it. We don't earn it. We can't ever pay it back. We are hopeless without him. Here, let me give you an example. The Jews. That's why he broke in about the Jews. That they were called, they were equipped, they were blessed. There were so many benefits to the Jews, and yet they still fell But has God done away with them? Paul said it. You've read it. I've read it. May it never be. And that was the point. And then when he's talking about this and their role in the plan of redemption, and it gets onto this incredible topic of the gifts and the callings of God, all these blessings that the Jews have that God has given to this particular group. And he goes on and says, God is not going to take those away because God is not an Indian giver. That's my interpretation. That's the Warby interpretation there.
That's right. Well, let's read Paul's interpretation. We'll read these verses again. So this is Romans 11, verses 28 and 29. Paul, after saying, "This is my covenant with them when I will take away their sins," from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. And then he finishes by saying, "For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable."
So here's the thing. Paul says that God says, my covenant with them, that's the Jews, it's going to take away their sins. They're enemies for the sake of the gospel, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they're beloved for the sake of the Father. So God is choosing them. He's not rejecting them. And then he says, the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. What does it mean if somebody says, well, that's irrevocable? I mean, if it's irrevocable, it means it cannot be reversed or stopped.
Yeah.
God gifted and he called the Jewish people, and he will never, ever, ever, ever take the gifts and the calling that he put on them away. And that's the context. He's talking about what God has given to the Jewish people will never be taken from them. He will not. That goes completely against his nature and character.
Yeah. And I guess that's a really important thing to keep in mind, isn't it? We've mentioned this many times on Foundations. Context, context, context. The three important rules for understanding Scripture.
Absolutely. And I'm going to add another one to that. The Scripture interprets Scripture. So if God says that this is irrevocable, if God repeats, this is my covenant with them, who? The Jewish people. If God says that my promises, my gifts, my callings on this people is never going to be revoked, that means we cannot interpret this according to church dogma or church tradition or our feelings or some new trend that comes into the church or what fits and suits our personal biases. We don't get to interpret Scripture the way we want it to. And again, this has happened a lot of times. People will read a particular verse and it's usually in the Old Covenant, where God will say, I'm done with you, and he's talking about his people. I'm done with you. I'm cranky with you. You've done the wrong thing. I'm going to judge you. I wipe my hands of you. You're not my people anymore. And then I always say, they say, see, that's what he said. And I say, keep reading. You get a few chapters down, he says, but I'm going to restore you. I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to revive you. I'm going to keep my promises. You will be blessed. I have a future for you. Even as they were going into captivity into Babylon, and they would weep and cry by the rivers of Babylon where we sat down. I'm not going to sing like Boney M. But God actually promised them while they were on their way, and then when they were in captivity, remember that the portion, we all love Jeremiah 29:11, for I have a plan for you in a future, and it's not for calamity but a hope, I've not quoted that correctly, but we love that for ourselves. That scripture was given by God to his Jewish people when they were in captivity in Babylon. Even though you're not going to see it right now, your people have a future and a hope because I have made a promise and I will not break it. That's God's promise to them. We're grafted in, so we understand the principle. But contextually, God repeatedly says, you're my people. I have called you. You've blown it numerous times. I deal with you when you do, but my covenant remains solid. My promise remains solid, and I will not fail in keeping my promises. Yeah. God has not done away with the Jewish people. It's
such a good reminder. Next time we're going to continue this series and look closer at the blind spot that Israel is currently experiencing.
This has been Foundations, a look at the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. For study notes, resources and more, see vision.org.au/foundations.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.